Hockey Night in Canada is a branding used for Canadian television presentations of the National Hockey League. While the name has been used for all NHL broadcasts on CBC Television, Hockey Night in Canada is primarily associated with its Saturday Night NHL broadcasts, a practice originating from Saturday NHL broadcasts that began in 1931 on the CNR Radio network and continued on its successors, and debuting on television beginning in 1952. Initially only airing a single game weekly, the modern incarnation airs a weekly doubleheader, with game times normally at 7 o'clock and 10 p.m. The broadcast features various segments during the intermissions and between games, as well as pre- and post-game coverage of the night's games. The Hockey Night in Canada brand is owned by the CBC and was exclusively used by CBC Sports through the end of the 2013 Euro 14 NHL season. Beginning in the 2014 Euro 15 NHL season, the brand is being licensed to Rogers Communications for Sportsnet-produced Saturday NHL broadcasts airing on CBC Television as well as the Rogers-owned City and Sportsnet networks. Rogers had secured exclusive national multimedia rights to NHL games beginning in 2014-15, and sub-licensed Saturday night and playoff games to CBC. History Radio Hockey Night in Canada has its origins in the General Motors hockey broadcast which transmitted Saturday night hockey games of the Toronto Maple Leafs beginning in November 1931 over the Canadian National Railway radio network. In 1933, the CNR's successor, the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, commenced broadcasts of Montreal Canadiens and Montreal Maroons games on its Quebec stations. In 1934, Imperial Oil of Canada took over the sponsorship from General Motors Products of Canada and the broadcast became known as the Imperial Esso Hockey Broadcast. The broadcasts began at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Starting in 1936, the games were broadcast on the CBC's successor, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The series acquired its present title around the same time, coined by Foster Hewitt. In much of Ontario and points west the show featured the Maple Leafs and were hosted by Gordon Calder with play-by-play announcer Hewitt and color commentator Percy Lesueur. Montreal broadcasts were hosted by Doug Smith and Elmer Ferguson. Broadcast for Montreal Maroons games in English and Rena copyright Le Cavalier broadcast Montreal Canadiens games in French. After the Maroons folded in 1938, Smith and Ferguson provided English broadcasts of Canadiens games. The great popularity of the radio show across Canada made it an obvious choice for early Canadian network television programming. Although never carried on any U.S. stations, the Hockey Night in Canada radio broadcasts became quite popular among listeners in the northern United States. If a U.S.-based team was playing in Toronto on a particular Saturday night, thousands of fans in the U.S. city whose local team faced the Leafs would often listen to the CBC broadcast via skywave reception, with the game often drawing far more listeners during the HNIC broadcast period than any local station. CBC Radio aired Saturday night HNIC broadcasts through 1965, then Sunday night NHL hockey through 1976, after which the games moved exclusively to television coverage nationally. In Toronto, CFRB continued to simulcast Maple Leaf games for many years alongside CBC Radio's Toronto station CBL. Television Hockey Night in Canada began airing on Saturday nights on CBC Television in 1952. From 1965 through 1975, in addition to the Saturday night game on CBC, HNIC also produced and broadcast a Wednesday night game on CTV, CBC's privately owned competitor. Beginning in the 1975-76 NHL season, these midweek games would begin to be broadcast by local stations. Until the 1990s, there was only one game televised each Saturday night in any particular locality and up to 1968, regular season games were still not broadcast in their entirety. In the 1950s, the HNIC telecast followed the lead of the radio broadcast by coming on the air at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, with the game typically being joined in progress either just before the start or during the early portion of the second period. In the early 1960s, The broadcast time was moved ahead to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, which allowed the game to be joined in progress late in the first period. Starting in the fall of 1968, regular season games were shown in their entirety with a broadcast start time of 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Beginning with the 1966 Euro 67 NHL season, all games broadcast on HNIC were in color. In 1970 Euro 71, the Vancouver Canucks joined the NHL, meaning that there were now 3 possible venues for an HNIC telecast. During the 1979 Euro 80 and 1980 Euro 81, 4 more Canadian teams, the Edmonton Oilers, Quebec Nordiques, Winnipeg Jets, and Calgary Flames, joined the NHL. The Oilers and Flames were featured frequently. In contrast, as the Nordiques were owned by Carling O'Keefe, a rival to the show sponsor Molson, they were rarely shown. After Wayne Gretzky was traded to the Los Angeles Kings in 1988, the network began showing occasional doubleheaders when Canadian teams visited Los Angeles to showcase the country's most popular player. These games were often joined in progress, as the regular start time for HNIC was still 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and the Kings' home games began at 7:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Beginning in the 1995 season, weekly doubleheaders became the norm, with games starting at 7:30 Eastern and 7:30 Pacific, respectively. In 1998, the start times were moved ahead to 7 p.m. Eastern Time and PT. CBC claims that Instant Replay made its debut on a 1955 HNIC broadcast. CBC director George Retzlaff made a Kindscope recording of a goal, and replayed it to the television audience seconds later. Olympic women's ice hockey champion Cassie Campbell joined Hockey Night in Canada in 2006 as a rinkside reporter, becoming the first woman to do color commentary on a Hockey Night in Canada broadcast. She filled in when Harry Neale was snowed in at his home in Buffalo. On July 23, 2010, Trevor Pilling was named the executive producer of Hockey Night in Canada, replacing Cheryl Jack. In September 2012, Steve Sloan and Joel Darling were named co-executive producers of Hockey Night in Canada. Trevor Pilling was promoted to the head of CBC Sports Programming. Present day, CBC's deal with the NHL ran through the 2013 to 2014 season, and was replaced in 2014-15 by a sub-licensing deal with Rogers Communications. The deal includes airings of games on the conventional over-the-air CBC television network as well as carriage of those broadcasts through digital media, including CBC Sports Car. The deal came after controversy and discussion before and during the 2006 July NHL season, when private broadcaster CTV Globemedia attempted to acquire exclusive Canadian distribution rights to the NHL for its own networks, including broadcast network CTV and cable channels TSN and ADS. Such a package, which would have left CBC without NHL hockey, would have increased TSN's previously existing coverage of NHL games. The attempt also came at a time when CTV Globemedia had outbid the CBC for Canadian television rights to the 2010 and 2012 Olympics, as well as the major television package for curling. Despite the rumors, it always seemed that CTV was unlikely to be interested in the nightly playoff coverage currently provided by the CBC, since weeknight games in April and May would conflict with new episodes of CTV's slate of American programming. As well, the title Hockey Night in Canada could not be used as the name is owned by CBC, unless CTV Globemedia paid royalties to CBC for use of the name. The current deal with CBC and Rogers maintains the 50-plus year tradition of Hockey Night in Canada on CBC, but also allows Rogers to expand its coverage. A caveat of the deal limits CBC to the number of games per Canadian team it can show so that the 7 Canadian-based teams, particularly the Toronto Maple Leafs, can distribute more games to regional carriers, thereby increasing the value of their local packages. In addition to television coverage, CBC produced a daily radio program, Hockey Night in Canada Radio, that premiered October 1, 2007 on Sirius Satellite Radio Channel 122. While the broadcaster trumpeted HNIC Radio's launch as the return back to the radio airwaves for HNIC, HNIC Radio was an NHL-oriented talk show that featured appearances by HNIC hosts and commentators, and did not cover games. After the merger between Sirius Satellite Radio and XM Satellite Radio was completed, the show moved to NHL Network Radio, which is found on Sirius Channel 207 and XM Channel 211. Although Rogers does not take over national radio rights to the NHL until the 2015-16 season, CBC chose to end the production of HNIC Radio for the 2014-15 season, citing high production costs between itself and Sirius XM, and conflicts with Rogers in regards to the transition. 2014, Rogers takeover. In negotiations for a new contract with CBC, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman had reportedly recognized the broadcaster's financial difficulties, and had offered CBC a smaller package which would have consisted of a national doubleheader on Saturday nights, reduced playoff coverage, and the loss of digital rights in the All-Star Game. Rights to the remaining properties not covered under the CBC's contract would have been offered to other broadcasters. However, CBC Sports staff, including Executive Director Jeffrey Orridge, continue to insist that it have exclusivity for every Saturday night game involving Canadian teams. In turn, CBC was unable to reach a deal. The league had reportedly aimed for its next round of Canadian television contracts to have a value of at least $3.2 billion in total. BCE made a bid for sole national rights to the NHL, and attempted to contact the CBC in regards to forming a partnership. However, CBC Sports staff did not respond. In turn, Rogers Communications also made a bid of its own. On November 26, 2013, the NHL announced a 12-year deal with Rogers for exclusive television and digital media rights to all national NHL broadcasts beginning in the 2014-15 season. The deal was valued at $5.2 billion, twice as much as what NBC paid for its own long-term contract with the league in 2011. As part of the deal, CBC sub-licensed a package of games from Rogers, allowing the network to continue airing Hockey Night in Canada at least the first 4 seasons of the agreement. The last CBC-produced Hockey Night broadcast aired on June 13, 2014, when the Los Angeles Kings clinched the Stanley Cup in a 4-1 final series over the New York Rangers. The broadcast closed with a season-ending montage, set to Queen's The Show Must Go On, that included highlights from the season and playoffs interspersed with images and sounds from CBC's 6 decades of NHL coverage. The new season marked a significant change in format for Hockey Night, as games are no longer split by region. Instead, CBC is joined by Rogers over-the-air City Network, the Sportsnet family of specialty channels, and FX Canada, who air other games nationally alongside CBC and share the Hockey Night in Canada branding. Decisions on network assignments for the games are made on a week-by-week basis, and ensure that viewers have on-air access to every Hockey Night game as they are being played. CBC continues to feature coverage of the New Year's Day NHL Winter Classic, NHL All-Star Game, Stanley Cup Playoffs and Stanley Cup Final, though it may be possible for coverage of the latter to be simulcast on a Rogers network if needed. CBC does not pay any rights fees to Rogers or the NHL. However, Rogers assumed responsibility for production and all advertising sales during the telecasts. CBC does not receive any advertising revenue, although it does receive free advertising time for its programming across Rogers networks airing Hockey Night games, and still receives some revenue from Rogers for its use of CBC-employed production staff and personalities during the games, along with its rent of offices and Studio 41 of the Canadian Broadcasting Centre for both Hockey Night and Sportsnet's overall coverage. Hockey Night in Canada had been a financial boon for CBC Television, which by one estimate received half of its total advertising revenue from the broadcasts. In order to assign responsibility for the content of the telecasts, compliance with regulatory guidelines, and advertising to Rogers, the HNIC broadcasts are broadcast on a part-time television network owned by Rogers' Sportsnet subsidiary, which is affiliated with CBC's English-language television stations. A license for this arrangement was approved by the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission in April 2015. The loss of NHL rights came as other reductions in funding and revenue had been occurring at CBC, which in turn led the Crown-owned public broadcaster to make budgetary, staffing, and programming cuts in its overall services. It also led to a decision by CBC in April 2014 to no longer directly compete for NHL or other pro sports broadcast rights. Among the staff members laid off were the advertising sales staff who handled Hockey Night under CBC. CBC President Hubert T. Lacroix, in an internal memo to staff notifying them of the Rogers deal, noted that though the arrangement with Rogers may not be the ideal scenario for the CBC, he felt the network would have suffered a major blow in prestige had it been shut out from NHL broadcasts entirely. Lacroix believed the deal is the right outcome for Canadian hockey fans, as it allows Hockey Night in Canada to remain on CBC and be made available to a wider audience and at a low cost to the broadcaster, especially in the lead-up to the 2015 Pan American Games and 2016 Summer Olympics, whose broadcast rights are owned by the CBC. CBC staff also described the agreement as a structured exit from NHL coverage in the event that Rogers does not extend the agreement. Rogers Hockey Night is guided by Scott Moore, who was named to the position of president of Sportsnet and its NHL coverage in January 2014. Moore had been with Rogers Media since 2010, and previously served as president of CBC Sports. After announcing its deal, Rogers set forth on reviewing on-air content and production of games and ancillary content, including the retaining and sharing of announcers and other personnel. The first major reveal of Hockey Night Euro's new look came on March 10, 2014, when CBC personality George Stroumboulopoulos was tapped to become studio host of Hockey Night and City's Sunday night hometown hockey package, working alongside Sportsnet's Darren Millard and Jeff Merck. The hire of Strombo, who is an alum of Toronto sports radio station CJCL and had been hosting his own CBC talk show, has been seen as an effort by Rogers to expand Hockey Night's appeal toward a younger demographic. Though Ron MacLean ceded hosting duties for Hockey Night to Stroumboulopoulos, he remains alongside Don Cherry on the Coach's Corner segment, and serves as the on-location host of City's hometown hockey games. Cherry, who has been termed as iconic by Rogers resident Keith Pelly, remains under contract with CBC through 2018. Besides MacLean and Cherry, several other CBC Hockey Night veterans continued in roles with HNIC and Rogers NHL coverage, including game announcers Jim Hewson and Bob Cole. Reporters Elliot Friedman, Scott Oake, and Cassie Campbell-Pascal. And analysts Glenn Healy, Kelly Rudy, Craig Simpson, Gary Galley, and PJ Stock. New hires include game announcers Dave Randolph and Paul Romanuk. Content and features on Hockey Night are spread out and featured on CBC, City, and Sportsnet, including Coach's Corner, which will remain for at least 2 years according to TSN personality Bob McKenzie. The brokerage agreement between CBC and Rogers had an impact on CBC's total advertising revenue, which fell by 37% during the final 3 months of 2014, in comparison to 2013. Industry analysts reported that, despite the increased promotion for other CBC programming that is available through the arrangement, that CBC may experience even larger losses in advertising revenue during the Stanley Cup playoffs due to games nearly every night over its duration. Coverage overview. Regular season. Pre-game show. Hockey Night in Canada coverage typically begins at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a little more than 30 minutes prior to the opening face-off of the first games with the pre-game show, Hockey Central Saturday, hosted by George Stroumboulopoulos and a panel of Sportsnet personalities. Prior to the Rogers takeover, Scotiabank Hockey Tonight aired prior to the first game, which was hosted by Ron MacLean, Kelly Rudy and Mike Milbury, if he was not on assignment for NBC. Game 1, the first game of the Saturday night doubleheader, typically originates in Eastern Canada, beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern Time/4 p.m. Pacific Time. CBC stations air the night's featured game. Play-by-play for the CBC provided by Sportsnet's lead commentator Jim Hewson, with Craig Simpson serving as color commentator. Prior to the 2014-15 season, additional games involving Canadian teams were split to air regionally on different parts of the country. For example, Winnipeg Jets games were often seen in central Canada, and Ottawa Senators games in the Ottawa area and eastern Canada. As of the 2014-15 season, these games are now carried nationally by either city or a Sportsnet channel. At the end of the first period, McLean hosts Coach's Corner, featuring himself and former NHL Coach of the Year Don Cherry. On Coach's Corner, Cherry analyzes the game's first period, shares his opinions on current issues surrounding the sport or league, and gives tips on various points of hockey, with McLean acting as Cherry's foil. There are times in which Cherry tends to be controversial. For example, in 2003, Cherry stated that the majority of players wearing facial protection in the NHL are French Canadians and Europeans. In any case, this controversy led to Coach's Corner being put on a 7-second delay for the rest of the season by the CBC. The 7-second delay has been subsequently removed from the broadcast, although the segment is still only shown live during the telecast of the first game that enters the first intermission. The Coach's Corner segment is followed by a recap of other games going on during the evening. There are also interviews with players in between periods, during which the players often brandish towels with the HNIC logo on it. During the second intermission, McLean previously hosted Hot Stove Tonight, a segment that features the HNIC hockey analysts, who debate and speculate on issues facing hockey. The cast includes Glenn Ely, Elliot Friedman, PJ Stock, and Kevin Weeks. Past contributors have included Al Strachan, Pierre Lebrun, Eric Duhatschk, Scott Morrison, Mike Milbury and John Davidson. During non-Saturday playoff games, after 40 minutes, which normally features McLean interviewing league or team officials, airs instead. In the 2013-14 season, Hot Stove Tonight was moved to Hockey Tonight, and replaced by After 40. Following the Three Stars selection of the first game, and before the face-off of Game 2, McLean and the rest of the second intermission crew talk about the early games and show scores and highlights of other games before breaking away to pre-game coverage for the late games. Game 2, the second game, airs at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, originating from a Mountain or Pacific Time Zone city and usually featuring one of the three teams from Western Canada. Since hurry-up face-offs were introduced, it is extremely rare that a regular season game runs longer than 3 hours, and every double-header game is seen in its entirety. The broadcast team usually consists of either Paul Romanouk and Mike Johnson or Dave Randolph and Gary Galley, the network's number 2 and number 3 teams, although sometimes Hewson and Simpson call the late game if it is deemed to be the marquee game of the night. Scott Oake is usually the ice-level reporter. Beginning in the 2013 NHL season, the first intermission of the second game features a short analysis segment with Ron McLean and Don Cherry, followed by the segments Inside the Game, and Scoreboard Saturday Euro, which features highlights from earlier games. Only on rare occasions has HNIC broadcast regular season games involving 2 US-based teams, and this has usually been due to exceptional circumstances. Special occasions have included Wayne Gretzky's final game in 1999, the retirement of Steve Yzerman's jersey in 2007, Sidney Crosby's comeback game in Pittsburgh against the New York Islanders in 2011, and the league's major outdoor games. The second game is followed by a post-game show. From the 2000-01 season to 2014-15, CBC aired After Hours, an extended post-game show hosted most recently by Scott Oake and Kevin Weeks. The program featured a wrap-up of the night's games, along with an extended interview and viewer questions with an NHL player or coach. Following After Hours, CBC previously aired Hockey Night in Canada Replay, an abbreviated encore presentation of the early game. The encore presentation was discontinued as of the 2014-15 season. Past features: Peter Puck, a series of 3-minute animated shorts produced by Hanna-Barbera, were regular between periods features on HNIC in the 1970s. Playoffs CBC also provides extensive Stanley Cup playoff coverage every spring with a focus on Canadian teams. They also have exclusive English-language rights to the Stanley Cup Finals. While its playoff coverage and rights to the finals will continue under the Rogers sub-licensing agreement, coverage will be shared with Sportsnet. For years, all playoff games involving Canadian teams were aired by the CBC, though not always on a national basis. From 2008 through 2014, rights to individual series were instead picked using a draft-like setup. In the first round, CBC first, second, fourth, and sixth selections among opening round series, and TSN had the third, fifth, seventh, and eighth selections. CBC tended to select series involving at least one Canadian team and series involving teams with strong Canadian fan bases. As a result of this arrangement, if more than two Canadian teams qualified for the playoffs, it was likely that at least one series involving a Canadian team would be broadcast by TSN. During the first three rounds of the playoffs, the NHL usually gives higher priority to NBC's requests to schedule afternoon games on the weekends, which results in little or no postseason contests on Saturday nights. This may include holding a playoff game on Saturday afternoon even if a Canadian club is the home team. Hockey Day in Canada. Since 2000, the CBC has aired an annual special Hockey Day in Canada broadcast to celebrate the game in Canada. The broadcast includes hockey-related features all afternoon, leading up to a triple-header of NHL action featuring the 7 Canadian teams. One exception was the 2008 edition that featured 4 games including 2 American teams along with the 6 Canadian teams. This was due to the NHL schedule format at the time, as there was no inter-conference games between Canadian teams. Lead commentators, Don Cherry and Ron McLean broadcast from a remote area. The broadcast includes live broadcast segments from smaller communities right across the country and features panel discussions on issues facing Canada's game at both the minor and pro levels. The day is usually in mid-February, but was broadcast in early January in 2002 and 2006 due to the 2002 Winter Olympics and 2006 Winter Olympics, respectively. The 2007 event was also held in January, though no sporting events key to Canada were scheduled. The 2010 events were held on January 30 because of the 2010 Winter Olympics, held in February. The 2014 event was held on January 18 due to the 2014 Winter Olympics, which were held from February 8 to February 24. Hockey Day in Canada has also featured special events, such as world record all-night pick-up hockey games from Red Deer, Alberta and Windsor, Nova Scotia. Viewers got to see the games after the CBC ended regular programming for the night, without commentary. Hockey Day in Canada was held in Whitehorse, Yukon on February 12, 2011. The Edmonton Oilers hosted the Ottawa Senators, the Toronto Maple Leafs visited the Montreal Canadiens and the Vancouver Canucks welcomed the Calgary Flames. With the arrival of the new Winnipeg Jets for the 2011 December NHL season, there was an odd number of Canadian teams in the NHL, meaning HDIC again required the presence of an American team. This season, the Jets played the Pittsburgh Penguins. HDIC will continue under the Rogers arrangement, with Scotiabank becoming title sponsor. As Sportsnet also holds national broadcast rights to the Canadian Hockey League, the 2015 edition included a primetime QMJHL game between the hosting Halifax Mooseheads and the Cape Breton Screaming Eagles. Broadcast locations: 2000, Toronto, Ontario; 2001, Red Deer, Alberta; 2002, Windsor, Nova Scotia; 2003, Iqaluit, Nunavut; 2004, Shawnhaven, Saskatchewan; 2005, no Hockey Day in Canada due to the 2004 Euro 05 NHL lockout; 2006, Stephenville, Newfoundland and Labrador; 2007, Nelson, British Columbia; 2008, Winkler, Manitoba; 2009, Campbellton, New Brunswick; 2010, Stratford, Ontario; 2011, Whitehorse, Yukon; 2012, Prince Edward Island; 2013, Peterborough, Ontario; 2014, Lloydminster, Alberta, 2015, Halifax, Nova Scotia, 2016. Kamloops, British Columbia, in January 2005, due to the NHL labor dispute, the CBC cancelled that year's broadcast. Rival TSN aired a similar broadcast instead, Hockey Lives Here, Canada's game, based from the World Pond Hockey Championships in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick. It also featured NHL players competing in an exhibition game to raise money for various charities in Hamilton, Ontario. TSN did not revive its version after the lockout ended. Lockout programming during the 2004-05 NHL lockout, CBC replaced Hockey Night in Canada with a triple feature of movies, mostly of the Hollywood variety. However, as a reminder to viewers that Saturday night was supposed to be Hockey Night, Ron MacLean hosted the movies from various hockey venues throughout Canada, under the title Movie Night in Canada. Ron would mention some facts about the film and talk hockey during the commercial breaks. The venues were usually those of CHL teams. A labor deal was reached in time to contest the 2005-06 NHL season. CBC's own on-air talent was also locked out during the summer of 2005, nearly missing the start of the hockey season. Some journalists have suggested that this helped cause TSN and the CFL to end their sub-license deal with CBC after the 2007 season, as games from that league aired without commentary during the lockout. During the 1994-95 and 2012-13 lockouts, the CBC ran classic Hockey Night in Canada games in its place. During the latter of the two lockouts, the games were selected by viewer polls at Nika Euro's website. Minority language coverage owing to the country's multiculturalism, Hockey Night in Canada has also produced special telecasts of games in the country's minority languages, primarily as part of Hockey Day in Canada. For HDIC 2007, the cable channel TLN simulcast a game between the Toronto Maple Leafs and Vancouver Canucks in Italian, with special features and commentary by Elf de Blasis, who hosts soccer games for TLN. For HDIC 2010, CBC also televised a game in the Inuit language in Attribution, with commentary by CBC North personalities Charlie Panigoniak and Annie Ford. In the years following, matches were also presented in Hindi, Punjabi, Tagalog, Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese. CBC subsequently broadcast one series per round during the 2008 Stanley Cup playoffs in Mandarin, and added a regular schedule of games broadcast in Punjabi via the network's website and some cable satellite providers. Citing financial issues, CBC suspended its Punjabi broadcasts just prior to the beginning of the 2010 November season, but coverage was subsequently restored for the 2013 season via a new sponsorship deal. On September 24, 2014, Rogers announced that it would continue to produce a regular schedule of Hockey Night in Canada broadcasts in Punjabi under the new contract, with the games moving to its multicultural Omni television stations. French. In parallel with CBC, its French-language sister network TAR Copyright La Copyright Vision de Radio Canada aired La Soirée Copyright du Hockey, featuring Montreal Canadiens games on Saturday evenings. In the past, the network also aired Quebec Nordiques and Ottawa Senators games occasionally during the regular season if the Canadiens were not playing that night, as well as the Stanley Cup Finals regardless of participating teams. Beginning with the 2002-03 season, RDS secured exclusive French-language rights to the NHL. The deal, negotiated with the Canadiens and not with the league itself, was meant to ensure a consistent home for all Canadiens games. Radio Canada did not bid for these rights, saying that, as a general interest network, it could not give up so much airtime to hockey. The announcement drew the ire of, among others, then Heritage Minister Sheila Copps, who suggested that the network would somehow be violating its conditions of license by not airing LSDH. In reality, there is no specific regulatory requirement that the CBC's networks carry the NHL, nor that the two networks have the same level of NHL coverage. During the years that SRC carried La Soirée du Hockey, play-by-play men included Rena Copyright Le Cavalier, Richard Garneau, and Claude Quenneville. Radio-Canada soon reached an agreement to produce the Saturday night games, to remain branded La Soirée Copyright du Hockey, to be simulcast on both SRC and RDS. That agreement was terminated after the 2004 playoffs, but the RDS-produced replacement, Le Hockey du Samedi Soir, continued to be simulcast on Radio-Canada outside Quebec, where RDS has limited distribution, through the end of the 2005-2006 season. Radio-Canada no longer simulcasts RDS broadcasts as of 2006-2007, and Rogers opted instead to sublicense French-language rights to the NHL to TVA Sports instead of SRC. Availability outside of Canada, as mentioned previously, during the era that HNIC was on radio, it was broadcast over several powerful CBC Clear Channel stations whose nighttime signals reached much of the northern United States. As a result, the games had a following throughout the northern U.S., and especially so in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and New York, the 4 U.S. cities that had NHL teams at the time. Foster Hewitt always acknowledged these listeners in his opening greeting, "Hello Canada," and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland. This continued into the television era, although some C-band satellite dishes can still receive the CBC's over-the-air feeds. U.S. cable television outlets near the international border: Seattle, Washington; Buffalo, New York; Burlington, Vermont and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, typically carry a nearby CBC affiliate on their systems. As a general rule, CBC stations are carried within about 150 miles of the border, and are not blacked out of sporting events. Beginning with the 2008-09 season, Hockey Night's main games were simulcast weekly in the United States on NHL Network, complete with pre- and post-game shows. If U.S.-based teams appear in these games, the telecast is blacked out in the markets of the participating teams or is televised instead by the U.S. team's local broadcaster. For example, if the Toronto Maple Leafs host the Boston Bruins in Hockey Night's main game, the NHL Network's telecast is blacked out in the Boston area and the game is instead televised by the Boston-based New England Sports Network. In the 2009 October season, only the first game of the HNIC doubleheader is simulcast live on NHL Network, with the second game and post-game after-hours program being shown in tape delay on Sunday, the sole exception being the Hockey Day in Canada event. Since the Rogers takeover, however, HNIC games on NHL Network now feature games regardless of broadcaster, and sometimes an HNIC game featuring 2 American teams is being shown as well. NHL Center Ice offers some Hockey Night in Canada games at the same time as the CBC broadcast. Usually these games are the regional Hockey Night games from either Ottawa or Montreal. Center Ice usually only shows the 7 p.m. Eastern Time games because the late games are usually national. Beginning with the 2006 playoffs, the NBC networks simulcast the CBC's coverage of some games, generally first and second round matchups from Western Canada, instead of using their own crews and announcers. In the early 1990s, Sports Channel America covered the Stanley Cup playoffs in a similar fashion. Versus, and its current incarnation as NBCSN, continues to use CBC and Sportsnet feeds to augment its own playoff coverage, sometimes even picking up a Canadian broadcast of a game involving 2 American teams. Hockey Night in Canada is also broadcast live in the UK and Ireland on ESPN and ESPN America. When the broadcast is shown on the main ESPN channel, it is also available in high definition on ESPN HD. The pre- and post-game segments are not included, but the entirety of the 2 games are shown, as well as the segments between periods. Hockey Night in Canada is also seen in some other European markets on ESPN America, distributed on multiple cable and satellite platforms. Until its closure in 2014, Canadian Forces Radio and Television rebroadcast HNIC games to Canadian Forces members stationed overseas. Hockey Night in Canada is available on Cayman 27 in the Cayman Islands as part of their regular Saturday night programming. Announcers: the legendary Foster Hewitt, who had developed a style that welcomed Canadians to the radio broadcast each week, proved that his radio style could also work in the new medium of television in 1952. His move from radio to television was successful, and Hewitt continued to work in television for many years, including the famed 1972 Summit Series between a team representing Canada and the Soviet national team. This style of play-by-play announcers in hockey broadcasting really hasn't changed between radio and TV, as broadcasters still describe the action as if viewers cannot see what is on the screen they're watching. Hewitt was followed by Danny Galivan, Dan Kelly, Dick Irvine, Jr., Jim Robson, Bob Cole, Hewitt's son, Bill Hewitt, and Jim Hewson. Previous show hosts included Rhys McKnight, Ward Cornell, Jack Dennett, Ted Darling, Dave Hodge and Ron McLean. George Stroumboulopoulos is the current host, and Jim Hewson, Dave Randolph, Paul Romanuk and Bob Cole are the current play-by-play announcers. Theme music equals 1952 minus 1968 equals, the television show's original theme song was Saturday's Game, a march composed by Howard Cable. The CBC and the advertising agency responsible for the broadcasts at the time, McLaren Advertising, later replaced the tune with the So Happy Motoring song. Equals 1968-2008, the hockey theme equals. The companies later commissioned the composition of yet another theme, the hockey theme, composed in 1968 by Dolores Claman and orchestrated by Jerry Toth. The CBC's most recent license to use the hockey theme expired at the conclusion of the 2007-08 NHL season. Claman's publisher issued a statement on June 4, 2008, claiming the CBC had informed them it would not be renewing its rights to the composition. CBC Sports head Scott Moore denied the reports, saying that the CBC wanted to keep the song and that negotiations on a new license agreement for the song were still ongoing. 2008, CBC loses rights to the hockey theme. In the early evening of June 6, 2008, the CBC announced it could not reach an acceptable agreement to renew its license, to the outrage of some viewers across the country. Perpetual rights to the hockey theme were subsequently picked up by CTV, which began using it for hockey broadcasts on its TSN and RDS Sports channels beginning in the 2008-09 season. The CBC said it had offered nearly $1 million for perpetual rights to Claman's theme, but that Copyright Music was asking for $2.5 to $3 million for those rights. Copyright Music turned it down because it was a settlement that barely covered our legal bills, let alone losses. One proposed payment method would have allowed CBC to continue using the theme at a cost of $500 per play, for a total cost of $65,000 annually, while not actually giving CBC ownership of the music. Despite being contacted by 5 parties interested in buying Claman's theme, Copyright Music had no desire to start a bidding war. Moore has been quoted as saying, "We have no real idea why the deal fell apart. We're not sure why because the other side hasn't communicated with us." Yet, Copyright Music states that Moore gave them an unrealistic deadline of 24 hours to meet him when his client was 5 time zones away. Moore has also been quoted as saying that he didn't think the Hockey Night in Canada show would lose viewers if he lost the theme song. "Hockey's a game, not a song," he said. Mike Myers disagrees with this ambivalence towards the song, calling it the second anthem of Canada. Canadian jazz fusion band the Shuffle Demons even jokingly introduced the song as Canada's national anthem during performances. In an informal poll on CBC's website which puts forth the question, "Can Canada go on as we know it without the Hockey Night in Canada theme?" 84% respond no. Equals finding a new theme. Canada's hockey anthem challenge equals, after the loss of the well-known The Hockey theme to CTV, CBC proceeded with a nationwide contest powered by the Philomobile Media Factory platform for a new theme in collaboration with music label Network. The contest began June 10, 2008, and at the end of the submissions period on August 31, the network had received over 14,000 entries. These entries were reduced to 5 semi-finalists, whose themes were rearranged by producer Bob Rock and presented for public voting: Ice Warriors, Jerry Mosby, Sticks to the Ice, Robert Fraser Burke, 11th Hour, Graham McRae, Let the Game Begin, Christian Street Roch and Jimmy Tanaka, Canadian Gold, Colin Oberst. There was some controversy when Hockey Scores, one of the highest-rated submissions, was not chosen as a semi-finalist. Voting commenced on October 4, 2008, with 2 finalists being picked for a final one-day vote. October 11, 2008 present, Canadian Gold, the 2 finalists Burke's Sticks to the Ice, and Oberst's Canadian Gold were revealed on October 9, 2008. On October 11, 2008, after a final round of voting, Canadian Gold was announced live by Don Cherry on Scotiabank Hockey Tonight as the new HNIC theme. Oberst received $100,000, plus 50% of the theme's royalties, the other half of which will be donated to minor hockey. CBC received exclusive rights on the theme for 3 years, and renewed the rights for the 2011-2012 season. A reorchestrated version of the theme was introduced for the 2014 15 season. It was arranged and orchestrated by John Herbermann, and recorded in Toronto with a 50-piece orchestra. Herbermann also created an extensive library of new stings and bumpers derived from the main theme. Awards. Hockey Night in Canada has received 4 Gemini Awards out of 6 nominations, most notably for Ron MacLean, 1992, Best Sports Broadcaster, Ron MacLean, 1994, Best Sports Broadcaster, Ron MacLean, 2004, Best Host or Interviewer in a Sports Program or Sportscast, Ron MacLean. Best Sports Program or Series, Joel Darling, Chris Irwin, Cheryl Lenajak. 2006, Best Host or Interviewer in a Sports Program or Sportscast, Ron MacLean. Criticism. Programming choices Critics of what the show chooses to program allege that Hockey Night particularly favors the Toronto Maple Leafs. On March 11, 2006, CBC did not air the pre-game sweater retirement ceremony for Canadiens legend and credited Slapshot inventor Bernard "Boom Boom" Jeff Ryan, electing to continue on with its planned broadcast of a Toronto Maple Leafs Tampa Bay Lightning game. The decision was worsened by the fact that Jeff Ryan had died earlier in the day. CBC did devote portions of its coverage to Jeff Ryan, including a pre-game tribute, and acknowledgements during the first intermission and Coach's Corner, while the ceremony was broadcast in full by French-language outlets. A CBC spokesperson explained that the network had only received a handful of complaints surrounding the lack of coverage. If CBC had aired the ceremony in full, it would have preempted coverage of the Leafs game for 40 minutes. A writer for the Ottawa Citizen considered the decision to be an example of this perceived bias towards the Maple Leafs by CBC, believing that they did not want to offend their fans by not showing their game in full. Content Criticism of the show's content often focuses around Don Cherry, who has made several controversial statements during his live-on-air segments. He has been accused of xenophobia towards European-born players, problematic because the broadcasts air live in Europe, and French Canadians, and is often seen as an advocate of the old-school rough style of hockey frowned upon both by some hockey fans and many of their TV partners. Despite these controversies, Cherry's popularity among English Canadians endures. The Canadian punk rock group Propagandhi has written a song, Dear Coach's Corner, that criticizes Cherry and the overt nationalism on display at NHL hockey games. As of the Rogers-produced Hockey Night, Coach's Corner was noticeably shortened, from as long as 10 minutes to as short as €5, a change that was lampshaded by both Cherry and MacLean during their first segment of the new season. The following Monday, Scott Moore had a short discussion with Cherry regarding the matter, laughing it off and explaining that if you have more to talk about, all you need to do is make sure you tell the executive producer what you want to talk about and we'll make sure you have lots of time. References: Mellanby, Ralph. Walking with Legends. Fiend Publishing. ISBN 978-55168-305-8. Notes. Further reading: Cole, Stephen. The Best of Hockey Night in Canada. Toronto, MacArthur and Company. ISBN 1-55278-408-8. Grenier, Richard. Whitson, David. Hockey Night in Canada, Sport, Identities and Cultural Politics. Toronto, Garriman Press. ISBN 0-920059-05-8. Potnieks, Andrew, A Canadian Saturday Night, Hockey and the Culture of a Country, Greystone Books, ISBN 978-1-55365-201-4. External links. Sportsnet NHL Hockey Coverage Website, CBC Sports NHL Website, Hockey Night in Canada Program Guide. Information from CBC Car, Foster's Shadow, The On-Air Meltdown of Bill Hewitt, interview with 1950s Hockey Night in Canada spokesman Murray Westgate, September 2011, Hockey Night in Canada at the Internet Movie Database, Hockey Night in Canada from the Museum of Broadcast Communications, Hockey Night in Canada Themes official website.